Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey, welcome everyone to Shape the System, and joined today by Eddy Badrina from Eden Green. And we're going to be talking a lot about vertical farming, but we're going to be talking a lot about food in general. And I think the economics of food is a big starting point here. So, Eddy, before we get to Eden Green, what I'd really like to do is to try to understand, and maybe specifically to where you guys are playing, what the economics of food production looks like today outside of vertical farming.
Well, first, thanks for having me on the show, Vincent. I think it's exciting to be here, and I love the fact that you talk about systems. I think in sort of systems thinking and framework. So just being on the show and talking about it from that perspective is very, very exciting to me.
Oh, good.
And, really what we are trying to solve is a system, and it's a broken down system of supply.
Right.
And the distribution of nutritious leafy greens, right?
Yep.
So the big challenge right now is, at least here in the United States, and it's probably very similar in the rest of the world, but in the United States, 90% of all lettuce is grown in two places in the United States.
By two geographic locations?
Two geographic locations in the United States.
Just curiously, where are those?
California and Arizona.
Got it.
So if I'm eating salads here in Dallas, or my colleagues in New York City are eating a salad, 9 times out of 10, that leaf of lettuce is going to come from 2,000 to 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, right. Wow.
And that's for the most, arguably the most well-off population, and, a little over 400 million people here in the United States. So that's a real problem. If one of the wealthiest nations in the history of the world still has to get their produce from 2,000 miles away.
Sure.
Right. And that's in a great economy.
Right.
Where we are now is post-pandemic, and then in this inflationary environment, is that the ability to ship that has become more expensive and has become more wasteful.
Right.
Right. So that's just lettuce. You could expand it out to leafy greens and herbs. It really is a distribution problem of produce. So the only people that get those, really, that nutritious produce that's fresh, are the ones who can afford it. And that's the top 1%, 2%, 3%. Everyone else is just on down the supply chain and not getting what they need, which ironically, the folks who are poorer, who are in the lower socioeconomic status, they're the ones that need it the most. Right. So that's what we're trying to solve. How can we get nutritious, affordable produce year round to the people that need it the most?
I want to just pause on a couple of things here. So firstly, the fact that 90% is grown in California and Arizona, I presume it's a conditions thing. Hey, the conditions for growing leafy greens in the traditional way of growing them exist there the most. Is that correct? It's not a subsidy or economic thing?
It's a conditional thing, but it's also just the way the farming industry has specialized crops, right? Both the farmers as well as the crops. They've just specialized in one thing, and so that's where they're growing it.
California went, we love lettuce, we'll be doing lettuce. By the way, just as an aside, this happens to be the case, at the moment, for a head of lettuce in Australia is about $9 US.
That's not a surprise. Not a surprise at all. It is.
There's a lot of surprised Australians at the moment.
Right?
What's that?
Yeah. It's just crazy expensive, right? Yeah. There in Australia, it's a very similar thing. There's only so much you can grow in the climate that y'all are in.
Right.
And so everything else you have to import.
Right.
Same with, a landlocked state like Singapore, same with folks in the MENA region, right? Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah.
Everyone is struggling with importation and just the cost of the supply chain. And at the same time, they're trying to solve for resiliency, right? Food independence.
Right.
So there are many ways to solve for that. And we are but one. But that in general is what CEA, Controlled Environment Agriculture, is trying to solve.
Sorry, that's CEA, did you say?
Right. How can you grow things more locally? controlled environment agriculture.
Okay, this will get us onto the vertical and other aspects of that.
Yes.
Just coming back a step, you talked before about, various socioeconomic groups and the lack of access to leafy greens and the importance of that in general nutrition. In the absence of that, what are people eating? Do you know?
So in the absence, they're eating processed foods, right? Things that last on the shelf longer,
right?
Things that are cheaper per pound or just per calorie, right? And then things that are more readily available, and they're readily available because they last longer on the shelf. And it just, the inventory, there's a larger inventory of that.
Part of the logistic issue here is that to have leafy greens, you kind of have to have fresh leafy greens. And if you have a logistical issue, you might have them, you don't have them fresh. You can't eat them. Okay.
So on their best day, leafy greens will last in a fridge, right? In a refrigerator for about 2.5 to 3 weeks.
Right.
That's ours. And those are really, really fresh, very high density in nutrition.
Yeah.
Conventionally grown leafy greens will last a lot less.
Right.
So when you think about a supply chain where they spend, I can just give the stats here in America, but, a 40-acre farm will produce, anywhere, call it around 2 million pounds of leafy greens per year.
That's about 1 million kilos.
1 million kilos
for our metric.
Yes, and I'm trying to remember like the hectares is, but I'll have to do the.
No, acres is probably fine.
There, right?
People get acres for some reason, but pounds seems to be a problem.
Right. So here's the dirty secret: is in that conventional 40-acre farm, they account for 20 to 30% loss on the field.
On the field from what, by the way?
Either they have what's called tip burn, or they don't look good enough to harvest, or they've already rotted, right? Or there's bugs, or,
anything.
And it just keeps on going, right?
Got it.
So you're already losing, just call it 20%. Let's 20% loss before it even gets off the field. In order to grow that, you'll need anywhere from you'll waste anywhere from 800,000 to 1 million gallons of water a year.
Right.
For that 40 acres.
Yeah.
There's, the plants transpire, they drink, but they also, there's evaporation and runoff, right? Mm-hmm. If it's a conventional farm, that 800,000 gallons of water is full of pesticides. It's full of fertilizer. It's bad runoff and it's wasted, right? Mm-hmm. So you have all that waste before it even hits the truck.
Right.
Then it hits the truck and it goes across the United States, or it goes into a distribution center. You're looking at about a week to a week and a half in system before it gets to the shelf.
Right.
So then really it's on the shelf for, 4 or 5 days, and hopefully gets picked up by a consumer, and then it's in their refrigerator for probably 4 or 5 days, and then it goes bad.
Right.
So all along that chain, there's so much waste.
Right.
And when you consider all of that waste, and then it'll only last in your fridge 4 to 5 days, if you're cost conscious, if you're being frugal, if you're trying to extend, your salary and your daily wages, are you really going to pick something that's only going to last 4 days in your fridge, or are you going to pick something that will last a week, 2 weeks, a month in your cupboard, your pantry?
Sure.
Of course you're going to pick the other stuff.
Even price competitive, like even if they were the same cost, you'd still be like, this lasts 3 weeks and has the same kind of density.
Yeah. So that split-second decision on whether to choose fresh or processed based on how long it's going to last, and then the value of that, not only affects you, but if you're a parent, if you have dependents, you're affecting your whole household's nutritional choices, right? In that split second in the grocery store, that's what you're choosing. You don't realize it, but that's what you're choosing. In essence, that's what we're trying to change, right? The value proposition is, if we can solve the distribution problem, we're actually solving for that split second decision of whether to choose fresh over processed.
Right. And so there's a kind of because you talk about it as a distribution problem, and I think that's obviously a key component of it, right? Like if you took the 20% off the field and the 5 or 6 days before it gets to it, arguably someone would have it in their fridge for twice as long, and the potential wastage just from their fridge alone would be, that 20 or 30% that gets wasted on the other side as well disappears. Yeah. But that feels to me like it's part of the challenge as well. I think part of this is distribution, which leads to, in some respects, better economics for the customer for the same cost.
Absolutely.
But then there's also the underlying cost of the thing when they buy it. I want to talk a little bit about the economics of leafy greens at the moment from the supplier perspective and from the distributor perspective, and to a degree from the retail perspective. How does that play out from field to table?
Yeah, at least for eating green, our grow costs, if you will, our production costs are almost the same, if not better than a conventional field.
Right.
And what our retail partners and our distributors are finding out is, wait a second, if it's the same price in the field and in your facility, in your greenhouse, then what's the big difference? And the big difference is we're right next to distribution centers.
Right.
So we virtually eliminated all supply cost as well as waste.
Right.
And when you combine those two, the cost of shipping, which is, it's roughly, I would say 5 to 10% of the cost of that produce, combined with the waste, which we haven't been able to calculate the cost of the waste because it's really built into the system. Do you know what I mean? Like people are already paying for that as a part of that 20% waste. It's just built into the cost. All of a sudden, I would argue you're unlocking close to anywhere from 20 to 25% of the cost of that produce.
Right.
Well, 25% is huge in terms of savings. When you talk about a consumer, it going down from, what it is in Australia, right? When it goes from $9 to $7, right? Okay. That is a huge difference for the average consumer.
Right.
That's where the economics come into play, is really you start to meaningful differences in the price of goods that are usually, for most grocers, they usually pass that on to their consumer.
Yeah.
And by the way, grocers here in the United States, I don't know about Australia, grocers here in the United States pride themselves on anywhere from 3 to 5% margins.
Yeah. Super thin.
Super thin, right? So if you're going from 3% to 6% or even greater because of produce, and you're still be able to pass on the savings to your customer as well as you taking twice the margin, that's revolutionary.
Yeah. Because there was something you said there that was interesting to me, and it relates to one of the questions I've got generally about if it was in Arizona and California, where would it be now in this world? And you said near distribution centers. Help me understand that a little bit better. Like, what does the distribution network in the US look like? Is that, hey, there's 400 major sites that all of the lettuce goes through, or what's just give me the architecture of these distribution centers and their relationship to retail?
Yeah. So the supply chain, I'll work backwards, right? So the supply chain here in the United States, whether it's to restaurants or grocery stores or, any sort of food service type institution, backwards from there to get it there, it comes from distribution centers. And the distributors, there's a handful of really, really big ones. And then there's all hundreds of smaller regional distributors. But those distributors then, for instance, Walmart, one distribution center of Walmart will feed 150 Walmart stores, roughly.
Okay.
Right. And so that's how it's sort of this spider web of distribution centers to the retail stores. Right. To get to the distribution centers, it usually comes from a supplier or what we call a co-packer, but it really comes from the supplier. So there's 3 steps, sometimes even 4 steps to get from the grower all the way to the retail store. Right. So that's how it's set up in the United States. And everything revolves around these distribution centers.
Got it.
So conventional wisdom for when people first encounter eating green and the fact that we can do an 1.5 acre greenhouse is equal to a 40-acre farm. But then instead taking from 2,000 miles away to right next to, the consumer, the average consumer will say, well, why don't you just put it next to a grocery store?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we can just go straight.
Right.
Well, in the United States, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
It always has to go through a distribution center.
Right.
So in our mind, we want to put it next to the DCs because then that eliminates any sort of cost, supply chain costs, and then the DCs naturally go to the retail stores.
My guess is the part of that is to do with the fact that when you're a retail store, it doesn't help having one of your suppliers next to you. You need to buy everything from the distributor. So you're like, put it there because I get stuff from there anyway. And even if you're giving me greens, I've got 4,000 other SKUs that I need to get, and I've got to get it from them anyway. So don't create a problem for me.
Yes, it's the hub and spoke model, right? So all of that, all of the SKUs, all of the products go into that one distribution center and they get spread out to each of the stores.
Now, I'm going to take a specific example, and I don't know the suburbs and the cities, but let's take Dallas. This is where you're at the moment. So Dallas is a city of what, 3 or 4 million people in terms of
the Metroplex is around
3 or 4,
3 million.
Greater Dallas probably in the order of 10 to 12, something along those lines. Don't know the answer to that.
I would say Greater Dallas Fort Worth and the Metroplex is around 4 million.
Okay, cool. So in that sense of the universe, there probably is 100 Walmarts, or maybe 50 Walmarts in that kind of general area. There's probably one late major distribution hub, or 2 or 3 potentially for that whole area. Roughly right. Where would they be relative to where people are? Like, how far out is this acre? And the reason I'm asking this is I'm interested in what happens in, the mass movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. And this has been happening for a while. And there's obviously been a little bit of walk back during COVID where people are like, I can work from anywhere, but still people are predominantly in cities. Cities are still getting quite expensive. So 40 acres, 1,000 miles from a city is cheaper than an acre 1 mile from a city. Where do the distribution centres end up being, and what do the economics of the real estate look like around these distribution centres to be able to warrant putting a 1 acre farm on it?
Yeah, so the distribution centers are usually they're surrounded. Honestly, they're either surrounded or they're within probably 15 to 20 miles of major population sources, right? Okay. So in the United States, in Dallas alone, I believe Walmart has 4 distribution centers.
Right, just living Walmart, presumably.
Yeah. And we're actually located across from one, and it's literally 20 miles from Fort Worth, right?
Yeah, right.
And then another distribution center is right in the middle of the Metroplex, right? And so they're usually located in light industrial zones, and they're not that far from the population. So that's sort of the setup, right? And so to do 1.5 acres, 2 acres for us makes financial sense in terms of CapEx costs and return on capital for our investors.
Yep.
Much more so than, 40 acres, 200 miles away, which is usually what is, 100, 200 miles away is where you're going to be able to find 40 acres and the workforce. So a lot of people don't focus on that. Is okay, maybe it's cheaper to do it 200 miles away on the highway, total access to the highway. They're like, well, it's still, it's only 200 miles. It's, 5-hour drive, whatever that is. And my question to them is, where are you going to find 200 workers, 300 workers to man that 40 or 60 acre facility, right? Out in the middle of nowhere? You're not.
Right.
It's going to be so difficult to find the workforce, especially now with unemployment being so low here in the United States. So conversely, if you put it near in a light industrial zone, near where other distribution centers already are, well, the Walmarts and the Amazons and everyone else, they've already solved for that. They've planted them purposefully so that they're near population sources and workforce sources, right? So we're just coming right alongside them and saying, hey, you've done the research, you've done the hard work, you know where the population is, you know where the supply lines are, the highways, we'll just plant right next to you.
Got it. And then from your perspective, and this is sort of getting into where Eden plays, if someone says, okay, I'm Walmart, I've got 4 distribution centers in Dallas, that area. What did you call it again?
A metro,
tri-metro, something, right?
Yeah. Metroplex.
Triplex.
Yeah.
How does it turn up? Like, do you say, hey, we're going to open this thing next to you if you agree to buy all the leafy greens? Or you say, we've got this technology that allows you to set this facility up and it's yours and they're your leafy greens? How does that play out?
We actually own and operate these facilities. And then we work with distributors and retailers to say, hey, we're going to build these next to your distribution center. We know you have already a steady inventory and need for X amount of pounds of lettuce or herbs or arugula or spinach or kale, whatever that is. If we build one right next to your facility and we can negotiate a price that works for both, do you want to take that, what's called offtake in the industry? It's just the harvest. Do you want to take the harvest, the offtake? Do you want to buy it from us? And so you negotiate that.
Yeah. And it kind of like there's some parallels here with people who make investments in renewable energy where they're like, I know I've got a fixed price contract for 10 years, so I know that the economics for this thing stack up.
Yeah.
And that usually is kind of a one-to-one with, hey, there's one distributor. We know how much you buy. We're going to right-size the facility to produce what it is with some headroom in case you want to grow. Is that kind of how that works?
It is, except for in our industry, there is no long-term 10-year contracts. It just doesn't exist in the produce industry. Yeah, it is a spot contracts, and it's really because of the volatility of the harvest, thing, right? And so I was talking about this earlier with a friend. The volatility in our industry was actually used to be dictated. It is dictated by the supply of greens and the supply of the harvests, right? And so in turn, because that is so volatile, what the distributors and retailers do is they then say, okay, that's too volatile for us. We're going to base it on the demand of the consumer. Right. And so sometimes it's kind of it's a hard system to be in right now, but they'll say, hey, we need 2,000 pounds of lettuce. Right. And then the next week they'll say, we only need 1,500 pounds of lettuce. You got to figure out what to do with the other 500. Right. And the next week they'll say, oh, we need 3,000 pounds. Like it is that variable, right? And so it throws the suppliers in a bit of a, it throws them for a loop a lot.
Yeah.
But that was just based on because the supply is so volatile.
Right.
And we're telling the retailers, hey, there's a new game in town. It's actually really disrupting the market in that you're going to have a steady access and supply with 2 to 3% waste total right next to your distribution center. Can you sign a different type of contract? Right. Right now, the answer is, that seems a little risky to me. But the more that we establish ourselves and the more that CEA as an industry becomes mature, the more that's going to be less of an issue. And I predict one day in the near future, just due to the need for surety and consistency of supply, one of these retailers will say, yes, we will sign a year-long contract with you because we just need that consistency.
Yeah, we need predictability. I mean, like anything, a business operating on 3 to 5% margin needs predictability. And at the moment it's said, well, you can't be predictable, so we're not going to be predictable. I know that sounds petty and childish, but I think that's
Yeah, absolutely. And the grocery, the retailer space, that market, more so than almost any other supplier or seller of goods out there in the marketplace today, that they rely on surety and consistency of supply more than anything else. Because if you're going to a grocery store and you find something that's maybe there's a recall or maybe there's you don't have their exact product, you'll probably buy it and you'll probably go to the store again and again. That's not going to put you off from the store. Right. But if you go to a store and it has empty shelves, there is a psychological mark in you that, man, I can't really trust them to provide the goods that I need. And I'm going to go to a whole other store.
Right.
So above price, above anything else, surety and consistency of supply is quickly becoming the top concern, the top brand marker of grocers and retailers.
That's a really interesting comment you make. And I'm only, of course, projecting from my sample size of one. I went out camping 2 weeks ago and decided to go to what I would call a discount chain here in Australia. Don't need to name it, but different to the one that I normally go to that is incredibly reliable, sometimes expensive, but incredibly reliable. And I went to a different one and thought, wow, there's some stuff here like leafy greens. As a good example, there was bag leafy greens that were about 30 or 40% cheaper than what else, what it would have paid at my normal store. But in trying to go there and do a shop to go camping, which needed about 12 things that were, for me, pretty normal things, I wasn't looking for weird stuff, I wasn't able to find 3 or 4 of those 12 things. I'm like, I can't do my weekly shop here. I'm going to have to do my weekly shop in both places, so I can't be bothered with that. So that's interesting about that convenience/consistency aspect that just says if you can't do the staples reliably and with high availability, I just can't operate both of them, so I'm not going to bother doing the one.
Fascinating.
You've
nailed it. You've nailed it on the head. But no one really thinks about that, right? No one really puts their they act upon it. They have their behaviors show it, but they don't really think through that. And it's not until you get into the industry that you realize, wow, consistency is the name of the game.
Yeah. That's super, super interesting. Just cutting back to consistency as well, because I'm thinking about, with Forever, we've taken 40 acres, put 200 people on it, and worked out how to turn it into a few tons of food over a 12-month period. I'm thinking that's about right, isn't it? 15 tons of food?
About right.
A couple of tons. In recent times, and I call this, in the last decade, realistically, I know vertical farming and greenhouse farming has been around for a while, but the ability to even be offering this and suggesting this as an alternative, just on a price parity perspective, if nothing else, means a few things have changed, right? It means the technology's got better, and I think that's a big part of it and a massive part of what you guys are doing at Eden. I think there's input costs that have changed. So the cost of getting people to do stuff is becoming, relatively speaking, more expensive. So people cost is becoming a bigger factor. And energy cost, I'm trying to understand what role energy cost is playing in this. So how have the macros changed that have made Eden and vertical farming generally more appealing now? And is this continuing? Is this trend still where we're going?
Yeah, the trend is heading that direction in that the operational expenses are coming down,
right,
and then the price is going up,
right.
But I would say, even as, we're probably one of the leaders in price parity with conventional produce.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the other CEA providers, they are assuming high fixed cost, ultra premium goods. Right. So when you talk about it addressing the market, it's just addressing the tiny, tiny sliver of the top of the market.
Sure.
I don't think the industry as a whole is really able to address the broad swath of market for some of the commodities. For some, they are. So for instance, tomatoes. If you've lived in the United States for the past 10 years, 15 years, and you've eaten a tomato, you've probably eaten one from a hothouse or a greenhouse, right? It's just the way tomatoes are grown now here in the United States. So there are some varietals that it's a done deal, right? Everything's grown in greenhouses. But there are much other varietals that have not even begun to be grown there because the margins aren't good.
Right.
And so the high volume, high weight, high margin varietals are what most of the CEA providers are addressing first. So if you see a lot of our peers, Plenty, App Harvest, Bowery, any of those, they're all starting with tomatoes and strawberries.
Right.
Because they're high margin.
Yep.
And they weigh a lot. Right.
So they cost a lot to distribute. Is that
and they cost a lot, right?
Yeah.
So very high margin. Mm-hmm. That's where you're seeing most of them go because that's what will make their numbers pencil into the black.
Right.
They won't, if they do lettuce, it's just a placeholder until they perfect the berry or the tomato growing aspect of it.
Right.
No one really wants to be in lettuce long term because it's just not profitable for them, right? Comparatively to a berry or an herb or a tomato.
Right.
But the reality is also very much a surprise. But the total addressable market for lettuce here in the United States, take a wild guess.
I'm assuming it starts with a B, so I'm going to go with billions to begin with. I'm going to go with $4 billion worth of lettuce consumed.
Double that. $8 billion for lettuce, not for
arugula, greens, just that
greens,
one.
Just lettuce. And it's growing 10 to 15% year over year.
Yeah, right.
Now, you tell me, if you can conquer an $8 billion market,
in one
would you even worry about the other stuff?
No.
Woo, come on. You can get to the other stuff later, right? And honestly, that's what Amazon did. Right. Amazon is a good example of someone conquering a high volume, low margin, sleepy, but gigantic market, which was books.
Right. Yeah.
And then from there, they conquered the books. They set out their distribution network, and then they started addressing other things because they already had the capital expenditure of the distribution network in place.
Yeah.
And it's no secret in our industry because I've told everyone that's our plan.
Right.
Our plan is to have a mesh network of greenhouses all across the United States, establish that mesh network with profitably each of those greenhouses. I talk a lot about unit level economics.
Mm-hmm.
Each unit, each greenhouse ought to be profitable, and they will be profitable at a very high rate.
Yeah.
So if I can establish the unit level economics over 80 of those greenhouses, well, then all of a sudden I've opened myself up to a variety of other products that I can grow there because I've already established any product that I grow can be blended in or will even increase my unit level economics of each greenhouse.
So probably two things that I'm going to play back to you there. One is work out how to be the Amazon for lettuce. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but that's sort of what I'm picking up.
It's ambitious, but yes, we're getting in that direction.
I know that's trite and reductive, but that's kind of what I have to do. But the second thing that's interesting there is if you can get lettuce right, you can get everything else right. Is that kind of the argument here? Don't tackle the berries, tackle the hardest possible thing because everything else from there is a game, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I do want to ask something about Amazon, and I'm thinking about the two big chains here, Woolworths and Coles, account for probably, it's phenomenal in Australia. It's like 70% of every retail dollar spent goes through one of those two at some ridiculous number. And I think about that in the context of, Walmart probably and Amazon to a degree, where they have this introduction of home brands, is part of what's happening is that there's a mesh of kind of the retail and the distribution, and Walmart owns all of its own distribution centers, and they introduce their own store brands. As part of this about actually selling that technology to the retailers who are saying we want to vertically integrate the whole thing, not the farm, but the fact of production and distribution and retail.
Yeah, I think that's further on down the road. Most of the retailers that we've talked to, they don't want to be farmers.
Interesting.
And so they want a technology that's so proven out and just rock solid that then it makes total sense for them to not just buy the technology, just acquire the company, right? And say, this is going to be our fresh produce arm of a much, much larger company.
I just want to check in on one word there. They don't want to be farmers in the traditional sense, but they do want to have the surety of supply. And if it no longer looks like farming, it's just a thing that they can turn the dial and give it electricity and the minimal of staff and resource. They're like, that's how lettuce appears now. And we don't have to worry about the proven nature of that. They no longer consider that farming, but supply. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So I think the vertical integration will come eventually. I think the technology is pretty new and no one's really proven it out at scale to where, a Walmart or an Amazon has really said, hey, we will rely on this. Have they made investments in companies? Absolutely.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They've made investments in companies, but they're more bets than actual hey, we're going to rely on these companies for supply.
Yeah. And bringing that back to yourselves, to Eden Green, and where you guys are up to at the moment. You talked a bit about scale. You threw out a number of 80 just then. Where are you in this kind of technology/adoption curve as a company and also from a product and technology perspective?
Yeah. So from a technology perspective, our technology is patented here in the United States and then in the EU and Australia as well.
Oh, good.
So no one else can really do what we're doing. Which provides a great moat in the technology world. It's a defensible moat, right? And we have a great defensible moat. So from there, what we've done is we have a pilot facility. We've built our second facility. It's going to go live in, I don't know when this will air, but as of right now, it'll go live in 4 weeks.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So we've gone from what we call turning dirt with gold shovels to our first harvest. We'll do that in a year total.
There's a great illustration opportunity there, turning dirt with gold shovels.
Yes. So we'll build that we'll have built that in 12 months. And then we're already starting on our third and fourth facilities.
And the nature of those is that once they're built with a distribution center in mind who said, hey, we're not going to give you a long-term contract, but if you got stuff there and it's price competitive, we will continue to buy it or we'll look to buy from it. Yeah,
absolutely. And here's how we know we're on the right track. We have not even completed this. Again, this greenhouse is 4 weeks from completion. The majority of it is already pre-sold. The harvests are already pre-sold.
Haven't planted the seed yet.
Yeah, well, have not even flipped the switch.
Flipped
the switch, planted the seed, whatever you want to say. Haven't even done that yet.
I love that.
It's already, harvest's already pre-sold. So we're pretty excited about that. We know we're on the right track when we're able to do that.
Yeah. And just in terms of where that puts you in the curve generally, this, people, I guess when there's physical infrastructure involved, people don't understand or don't appreciate the level of capital intensive nature of having to build physical infrastructure. And I think about an interview we did with Julia and Geordie Kay, a great rap, and they built a facility to build a compostable cling wrap, I think is what you'd call it, or saran wrap is what you'd call it. And just getting one big facility that produced all this stuff was like a massive step up. How, like, if you're about to launch number 2 4 weeks from now, we're talking at the end of June, so end of July. How, like, what does that like, just in terms of the overall economics of the business, not the unit economics? What's that step change look like for you? And then why is that the kind of the tipping point for you to then go from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for investors and for the markets, they're looking at this facility and saying, we want to see this in action, because the unit economics and the economics for the company that we are projecting out of this are game changers. I mean, we're looking at, I'll just tell you, the profit margins are great. The gross margins are above 50% gross margins. Right.
That sounds a lot more than a traditional lettuce grower.
Oh, it's a lot more than most businesses. Just a business.
Yeah.
Right.
That's level economics, by the way.
when you're getting to 50 and 60% gross margins, you're getting in a technology company margins. Right. And so that's what we're really excited about. And that's what the market and the capital markets are looking at. Like, man, if you guys can do this one with the margins that you say you can do it, it is an industry changer.
Yeah.
Right.
How do we build the next 100
How do we build the next 10 as quick as possible? Exactly. Yeah. So that's why it's so important. That's why we're so excited about it. And that's why everyone's sort of looking at it, right? It's not even because of the technology. Right. The technology's proven and people are like, man, we know you can grow. Right. It's really down to the numbers. Yeah. It's a cold, hard numbers game and we're out to win it.
Yeah.
Right.
I love hearing this in your voice, by the way. It obviously permeates through the rest of the team and the culture. What kind of people, by the way, are working at Eden Green? Like what's the name? I've got a sense of your nature, but generally
they're the best. They're the best. So the 2 founders are from South Africa, and they invented the technology in their garage. Right. And they really invented it because they just had this life-changing moment where they were feeding folks in their town in South Africa, and this kid was stuffing his pockets full of candy. And they said, hey, hold on, slow down. You don't need to stuff your pockets. There's more than enough to go around. They asked his teacher, hey, what's his story? And basically the story came out. He's 5 years old, but he's stuffing his pockets because it's not his day to eat. He's bringing it back to his 3-year-old sister so that she can eat. And that was their meal for the day, was the candy.
The candy, lollies.
Yeah. So they just looked at themselves and like, man, what kind of world do we live in where a 5-year-old kid has to choose which day to eat?
Yeah. And
so
what to eat.
That is the genesis of Eating Green. And that continues to be our mission. How do we farm food and feed people in a markedly different way? Right. And so the people that are attracted to working with us not only enjoy a living day's wage and health benefits and a generous, corporate culture where we're not trying to treat our employees fairly. We're actually trying to treat them generously. Right. It's not just that. It's also the fact that they see this mission and they see the way that we're trying to change the way that we farm food and feed people so differently than any other person or any other company that they want to come and join us. Yeah. So that's exciting for me. It's a big, it's exciting for me. It's also humbling for me, right? To be able to lead that team and to keep that mission going and to understand that mission cannot go unless we are profitable. Right. Unless we can fund more greenhouses and build this mesh network that we're talking about. Yeah. Right. You can hear it even more excited than making money. It's this idea of this mission that we have, which is unstoppable, and it attracts the right type of people. Yeah. Right. In this crazy unemployed, this low unemployment environment, we are still attracting so many applicants as we build this new greenhouse and are providing 30 more jobs. We have so many applicants, 10 to 15 times the number of applicants for the number of spots that we have. Yeah. Because people just hear about us and they want to work with us.
And bring that back to you and your, not place in the company, but the arc of the story that brought you to be working on this problem with this group of people and these founders. Play that arc back and as far back as you need to go as well. I'm curious as to how you arrived here.
So I had the opportunity to work for 2 presidents.
Yeah.
I worked for George Bush Sr. in his personal office after he got out of the presidency. And then I had a chance to work for W. Bush's administration.
Mhm.
So I got to see the landscape, the global landscape, what America had to offer, as well as the deficiencies here, but also globally, right?
Mhm.
So I had this global perspective. And then I moved back to Texas from DC, got tired of the political life, moved back to Texas and started my own company and bootstrapped it in 2010, built it up to 2016, sold it, bought it back 11 months later, and then sold it again.
Of course.
So it's a totally different story. It's probably a different
We have a different
podcast.
show for that, so we'll cover that
different show. But while I was doing that, I really thought, okay, what do I want to do next? Right. I was, that was almost 3 years ago. So I was 42. Right. What do I want to do next? I had been there, done that, gotten a t-shirt for professional services.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do something else. And the three things that I articulated to myself was that, one, I wanted to run a hardware software company.
Mhm.
Two, I wanted to have an exponential impact such that for every 1 unit of effort that I put out, I wanted to see a 10 to 20x return on culture and society around me. And then the last thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to build or be a part of a redemptive organization. And a redemptive organization is where leaders are sacrificial. Leaders eat last.
Right.
It's where employees are treated generously, not just fairly. And it's where culture is not just advanced because of this company, but it's actually renewed and restored even above to a different baseline than where it started. Right. So those are the three things. I articulated those to myself, to my friends and my colleagues around me. I made sure it was coming from a healthy place and not from an ego-driven place, right? And then I just let everyone know about it. And about 9 months after I was able to crystallize and articulate all that, I came upon Eden Green. Great technology, great vision. They just needed help wrapping a business model around it, turning the technology into a business, going, a go-to-market strategy, a product market fit component, a sales strategy, and then just taking it to market. So that's why I came on board. I saw the mission or the vision of what the brothers were doing, what they had built, and I knew I could take it to the next level.
Yeah, it absolutely sounds like. I'm curious about a couple of things in this, though. This idea of you call it a redemptive business model.
Yes.
Is there some historical context in that? Like, I'm trying to understand where that term. I've not heard that term before. I'm curious. I understand it now, but I don't know where it's coming from.
Funny you should ask. There's an organization, a nonprofit out of New York City called Praxis Labs.
Okay.
And people can find it at praxislabs.org.
Yep.
But they're friends of mine. They have created this framework to think about organizations, both for-profits and nonprofits, companies and NGOs, to think about this redemptive way of being in society as a company, as an organization. And so it requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of intentionality and purpose, right? Because everything in our culture will tell you to not be sacrificial. It will tell you to glean every dollar out of that you can for you, the leader, the CEO. You got to make the most money. You got to glean everything out, right? It's all about shareholder value. It's not about stakeholder value. So it's about, not just maximizing, but exploiting employees. And it's about just doing it with your own singular, selfish and even a company selfish types of goals in mind, and not looking at the context in the culture and society in which you sit and in which you sell, right? So all of those things in the world are being espoused and celebrated even, right? And here you have to think intentionally and purposely about, okay, what do I do that's so opposite from that? But it still makes financial sense.
Still sustaining.
Still economically sustainable. That's a good word you said. You talk about sustainability. When we, in the business culture today, when we talk about sustainability, we think about environmental sustainability. And I would argue sustainability is so much more. It's much more holistic. obviously you've got to be mindful of the environment around you. How are you helping to improve and set aside and conserve that for not just for our generation, but future generations?
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to be economically sustainable. Otherwise, that thing doesn't last. Right? I had a friend who challenged us to think about olive trees. So if you plant an olive tree, take another guess. I'm giving you a couple of wild guesses.
Yeah.
Take a wild guess on the first harvest after you plant an olive tree. How long is it until you get your first harvest out of an olive tree?
I'm gonna go with 10 years, but I'm guessing it's
Close.
actually more than that.
Eight years
eight
on
years.
average.
Wow.
Right? The oldest olive trees in the world, the MENA region, they're estimated to be around 3,000 to 4,000 years old.
What?
Yeah.
Still producing olives.
Yeah, still producing olives, right? So then the challenge, he said, is, hey, what are you building? Either a company, your family, your relationships, what are you building that you won't expect and harvest for 8 years?
Yeah. And also,
then what are you building that you expect to last 4,000 years?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Right?
I love it.
If you're not thinking intentionally about that, you're not thinking redemptively.
Yeah. I've got one question for this, by the way. Because this mode of thinking is fascinating. We'll put a link to Praxis Labs into the show notes. Was there, and just as a kind of a closing question as well, was there a moment that shifted you personally to think about this way? Was it always internalized and you said, I just need a framework in which to operate, and Praxis Labs kind of turned up through your network? Or was there something that happened that changed something in you around this?
I think it was buying the company back and then understanding hey, what type of legacy am I going to leave? I think it happens for a lot of people, but for me, it just happened right around the age of 40. Right. And realizing half my life was over on average. And I probably have half my life left. Right.
Yeah.
So the first level thinking is, okay, what else can I do?
Right.
The second level thinking is, okay, why do I want to do something else? What's the motive behind? Is it just I want something different? Again. I want variety, right? Yeah. What is it, right?
Right.
And then you can go down that route. And I went down that route of okay, so am I, what does it do for me? What career do I want it? What sort of legacy do I want it in my career? But then it just started to manifest itself more and more in helping me think about, okay, think beyond the career. Think to my headstone. I tell a lot of younger folks who come to me just for advice and insight, hey, what are you thinking about? And more often than not, and this goes back to your question, is I think about the end in mind.
Right.
If you start with the end in mind, and for me, part of the end is my tombstone. Right. If I think about my tombstone, the last thing I want on there is the name of BuzzShift, which is the first company I started, or even Eden Green.
Right.
I don't want, that's a failure if that's on my tombstone, right?
Right. That's how
what do you want on your tombstone?
Right.
You want, beloved father, faithful friend, right? Loving husband, all that stuff. That's what you want on your tombstone.
Right.
So if you think about that, then everything you do should lead up to that tombstone. And if it's not aligned with that, then what are you doing? Right? So then think about past the tombstone.
Sure.
Think about your kids' tombstones and your kids' kids' tombstones. And what are they saying? Well, their tombstones will probably be a reflection of what you had on yours.
Right.
More often than not. Right? You're leaving a legacy. So it's this weird deal for me of understanding I've got a legacy to leave that goes way beyond me. And I also know I'm one of 6 billion people on this planet. It's a wisp. It's just a
thing in the wind.
A wisp in the wind, right? It's ephemeral.
Yeah.
So there's that contradiction for me of, can I make a lasting legacy? But then it's also ephemeral. So then it's not even about me.
Right.
Then the legacy is just hey, can I do something for the greater good?
Right.
I may not even be remembered. I probably won't be remembered, and that's fine. But can I do something that lasts way beyond me?
Yeah.
And that is really the driver for me every day is the legacy beyond the tombstone.
Amazing. Eddy, this has been enlightening, fascinating, and personally lovely to be talking to you today. I'm really hopeful and excited, to be honest. We're talking late June. A new factory comes out and the whole team and yourself obviously working towards that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So wishing you all success and hoping that, this conversation can be part of immortalizing part and stepping along that journey. So thank you incredibly for joining us today on Shape the System.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.